In the last lesson, we learned about the observer pattern and how we can use it for state management. We also saw how we can use the onAppear method to trigger our networking code. So at this point, we need to figure out how to display a website in our app when a user clicks on one of the list items. So how do we go about doing that? How do we display the details of a list item? Well, in that case, we would need another view. So let's go ahead and put our content view into a new group from selection, and we'll call these our views. And in addition to the content view, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to create a SwiftUI view file this time. I'm going to call it our detail view because that's the detail that will show up when we click on one of the cells in our list. And inside this detail view, the most important thing that needs to be passed over is going to be the URL as a string. But of course, because the URL can be nil, I'm going to set this as an optional string. And because we now have this property that needs to be initialized, in our preview, we also have to provide a value for the URL property. So I'm just going to put https://www.google.com and then close off the string right there. Then I'm going to select this hello world placeholder, hit enter for it to be solidified into our text. And now if we resume updating, you should see that the detail view is just going to be a pretty blank view. And all it does is just show the words hello world. But the important thing is, how do we get to the detail view? So to do that, I'm going to navigate there from my content view. And the idea is that whenever a user clicks on one of these items in the list on their titles, it should take them to the detail view. So how do we create this behavior? Well, in order to do that, I'm going to use something called a navigation link. And this navigation link is going to create a button on the right-hand side of each cell, and it's going to trigger a presentation to the detail view when it's pressed. And we're going to initialize our navigation link using this particular initializer. So we're going to create a destination. So what are we going to show on screen with the transition when the user clicks on this link? And then we have to create a label, which is what are we going to show inside this link? So you can imagine each navigation link now is going to be a cell. And what used to be in the content of our cell is now going to be the label of our navigation link. So let's hit enter on this one. And the destination is going to be a detail view that we created just now. And of course, detail views need to be initialized with a URL. So it's going to be the URL that we get from our post.url, the one from our API request. And then in our label, we're going to add a closure. So we're going to hit enter on that template code, delete this placeholder, and then move what used to be inside our list cell into our navigation link. And then I'm going to select Command A and Control I to re-indent our code so that we can see it a little bit better. And then I'm going to go ahead and run my app. So now you can see that when our list gets rendered, each of them come with a little disclosure indicator on the right. So it tells the user that this is clickable. And when I click on this, it should probably take us to discover more about this particular post. And when I click on it, it indeed does take us to our detail view. So we've now got a two-screen app with a list view and a detail view. And we now have to turn this detail view into a web view that shows the actual news piece based on that URL that we're passing over. So let's go over to the detail view and try to achieve this. Now, in order to display a URL inside effectively a browser without the search bar and the other parts that make a browser, in fact, just a window basically that shows the content of a URL, we need to use something called a web view. But unfortunately, there is no such thing as a web view for SwiftUI, at least at the time of recording. So instead, we have to go to UIKit land and borrow some of the big boy tools over there. So to do that, I'm going to create a new struct called a web view. And in this struct, I'm going to try and construct a SwiftUI version of a UIKit component, which is the WK web view. And in order to use the web view, we first have to remember to import the web kit. So now I can create my struct called web view, and it's going to conform to the protocol, which is UI view representable. And this allows us to create a SwiftUI view that represents a UIKit view. So let's hit enter on that and create it. And now you can see this web view doesn't conform to the protocol. In order to silence these warnings, we have to create two delegate methods in here. One is called makeUIView, and another is called updateUIView. So when we make this UI view, it's going to try and create a UIKit web view and turn it into a SwiftUI web view. So the view that we want to make, so what we want to return, is going to be a WK WebKit web view, and then we're going to add the parentheses at the end to initialize it. And in order to update the UI view, or what should we display in it, we're going to use the URL that got passed into the detail view and try to render a WebKit view that uses that URL. So let's add a property to this struct called URL string, which is going to be an optional string. And then in the body of our detail view, instead of creating the hello world text, we're going to create this web view. And we're going to initialize it with that URL string, which is the URL that we got passed over into the detail view here. So now we can focus on our web view. And in our web view, when we need to update it, we're going to first check to see the URL string actually has some content. So let's call it safe string to make it easy to see what's going on. I'm going to set that to equal the URL string. And if that is not nil, then we're going to say if let URL equals URL from string, and we're going to use that safe string that we unwrapped just now. Now, finally, we can create a request from this URL, which is a URL request, and we're going to pass in the URL as the safe URL that we just created just now. And then the final thing we have to do is use the UI view that we made up here, and then use one of its method, which is called load, and it should load our request. Now we're getting a few errors here, and the first thing that we have to fix is the data type of the UI view that we've made over here, which we know is actually not a web view, it's actually a WK web view. Now, in addition to that, we can actually simplify our code a little bit. Instead of using this really long and complex UI view representable context that is of type web view, we can actually use a type alias, which is just called context, which you can see is basically the same thing. It's just the same type as what we had before. So let's replace both of these places with context to clean up our code. And now what should happen is when the detail view loads up, it gets passed a URL string, which gets used to create a web view from a UIKit component, which is called WK web view. Once that gets created, then we update it by loading the URL that is meant to show in our detail view. So that's the theory. Let's go ahead and run it and see if it works. As soon as we load up our app, we get all of our posts. And then if I select one of these posts, it goes to my detail view and it loads up a UIKit WK web view, showing me the actual article that I've selected. And here I can actually read what is the content of each of these Hacker News pieces. So perfect. So now our app works beautifully. Let's do a little bit of refactoring to reorganize the code in our project. In particular, I don't really like how our web view is sitting in the same file as our detail view. Let's move our web view out of our detail view by creating a new file in our views folder, which is going to be a Swift file, and this is going to be called our web view. And then I'm going to cut it out of here, delete the import, and paste it into our web view and add the import back, as well as add the import for SwiftUI so that it knows about the context and UI view representable. And we can change this output to, again, a WK web view. So now we have this reusable component, which is a web view, so that in the future, if we wanted to build a web view in our SwiftUI components, we can simply just tap into this structure. And that completes the project. I know that this was a very challenging tutorial that built on a lot of Swift programming concepts, but it allowed us to revisit and review everything that we've learned so far. In addition, we also covered some advanced topics like using the observer pattern for state management. So well done for making it through this far. Now in this lesson, we've reviewed a lot of the concepts that we learned in the course previously, such as networking, URL session, JSON decoding, and we've also looked at how we can create a SwiftUI-based list view with a navigation link inside that takes us to a detail view, which relies on a UIKit component, which we've converted to be used with SwiftUI. We've also looked at a more advanced way of managing state. So we've created our data model, namely our network manager here. We've made it an observable object so that it can publish certain properties that it has access to, and other objects can subscribe to the network manager and listen for changes in those properties in order to update its views accordingly. So that's quite a lot of stuff that's been jam-packed in here. So where does this leave us with SwiftUI? SwiftUI is very, very new. So in the coming days, weeks, and months, I would not be surprised if SwiftUI completely changes, where maybe there will be a native SwiftUI web view and we don't have to use UI view representable anymore, or the way that we work with observed objects and observable objects might change as well. In fact, even within the last few days, the way that Apple showed us how to work with observed objects and observable objects already changed since when they announced it at WWDC. So for those of you guys who remember what Swift version 1 was like, I can say that there's going to be a lot of changes yet to come. But the good part is that we get to stay on top of the changes. So if you're somebody who doesn't like working with buggy software and beta testing for Apple to be able to report errors and let them know what needs to be done, what's wrong, what needs to be fixed. If you prefer to work with stable code and stable components, also if you're actually building a very serious app, I actually recommend sticking with UIKit for now. SwiftUI is going to take maybe 3 to 5 years to mature before the code is actually stable and usable to create anything that's serious. But meanwhile, it's really fun to get started and to be at the bleeding edge and be an early adopter to see how this technology develops. So I would love to know what you think of SwiftUI, and if you like it, if you don't like it, what your thoughts are on this technology. So feel free to leave your comments in the Q&A section or hit me up on Twitter at @u_Angela. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk to you about something called Project Catalyst, which is going to allow us to easily turn our iOS apps for iPhone and iPads straight into a Mac application just by doing a few things. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.